So hello, everyone. I have the pleasure to wish you warmly welcome to our webinar on diversity and inclusion in art criticism. This is the first session in a series of 3 international webinars. The other ones will be organized later in March and October 2022. And this webinar is organized by the Finnish Critics Association, SARV, more specifically by its project Shine On Critique, or in Finnish, Kritiikki näkyy. The webinar is organized in collaboration with Nordicom, which is a center for Nordic media research at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And I'm Maarit Jaakkola. I'm co-director of Nordicom, and I'll be the host of today's session. Today we will discuss, as said, diversity and inclusion in criticism and ask what these two concepts mean for reviewing, evaluating art. Power structures in criticism has been discussed as long as the institution of criticism has existed. But now we have 2 policy terms, diversity, inclusion, to address these issues. And diversity and inclusion have been richly discussed in cultural sector, in cultural organizations, at least in the Nordic countries, but not that much in criticism and art reviewing. However, these concepts are very valid for criticism as well. New language groups, religious communities, and ethnic communities have grown and become more visible in our democracies. Arts and cultural organizations must be able to identify discriminatory structures and recruitment practices and recognize these in varying degrees in their existence. And this applies to media organizations as well. As arts criticism is part of arts journalism, media organizations play a role here. Expertise related to cultural diversity, equity, and equality should be developed even in critics' cultural communities. But how? How can critics contribute to a more equal and inclusive art world, or how can criticism be a more equal and inclusive field of work for everyone who wants to get engaged? Well, this is the topic for today, and we have 3 speakers from Finland. Unfortunately, our only Swedish speaker got ill and had to cancel her participation today. But now we have a bit more time to discuss, which is always a good thing. We have 15 minutes of presentations and followed by a short discussion where you can ask questions, and you can also leave questions to the chat box at any time and we'll pick them up. When discussing the development of criticism, a key actor in Finland right now is the project Shine On Critique. The mission of this project is to approach criticism from new, fresh angles and to ignite discussion about the development of criticism. So far, the project has been carried out in Finnish and in Finland, but now the aim is to open up the discussion in a more international or at least Nordic context. And we will start by the presentation of the project. Shine On Critique has so far published a Finnish language book on inclusion and criticism, and we'll leave the link to the chat box because it's open access, available online. And they will soon organize a workshop for reviewers on the same topic. So this is a very timely theme. Maaria Ylikangas is project coordinator of Shine On Critique, and she will now tell us more. Welcome, Maaria. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Maarit. It's good to be here, and it's very nice to open our international part together with Nordicom. I am Maaria Ylikangas, the coordinator in Shine On Critique näkyy projects, and I am also a critic, so this webinar will be very interesting for me too. In a nutshell, we are a project on arts criticism arranged by Finnish Critics Association and funded by Kone Foundation. This project is altogether 3 years long, and it has many different parts, and all of them are focused on making arts criticism more visible in the media, creating new ways and channels for criticism, and to enhance inclusiveness on the field of art criticism. During this year, we have been focusing a lot on the questions of inclusivity in arts criticism by publications, mostly in Finnish. And we have arranged some education for critics as well. We also work with local newspapers in Finland, arrange performance art on criticism. We create media connections and work with new ways of criticism, which may mean both new media and some new ways of making reviews and criticism. Shine On Critique perceive art criticism as a vital part of living media environment, as a tool for democracy, freedom of speech and discussion on arts and culture. This is a guideline for all the activity we produce. This webinar is the first one in our series of webinars. It's called Renewing Reviewing, New and Innovative Practices Among Art Critics. We have 2 more of these coming up, and next spring and autumn. They are focusing on criticism and politics and economic structures of arts criticism. And for our Finnish-speaking audience, there will be a workshop after each webinar in a week about the themes of the webinars. There's still space on the inclusivity workshop if you are interested, but these are only in Finnish. And of course, this was supposed to be something very different. We were planning on 2 days international seminar in Helsinki with speakers from all around the world. But thanks to cooperation with Maarit and Nordicom, we came up with this series in the current pandemic situation. This seemed to be a sensible solution for international activity. But I'll give the microphone back to Maarit if she has some questions on our project.
Yes, thank you, Maaria. I think this is a terrific project. You could perhaps even say that that's the best that has been happening for criticism during the past years in Finland, because doing something concrete to develop and experiment with criticism is something that has been quite welcomed by the field, I think, because normally when you are talking about criticism, you keep hearing that no one cares about criticism and its development, and it's a format that is pretty much outdated and underdeveloped, and no one cares how to digitalize it, how to put it into new environments and re-innovate and do some development work. And I think this project opens up new horizons for thinking about reviewing and reviews. And I think it would be interesting to hear, based on your discussions with reviewers, because you have had quite a lot of encounters with critics. You have had these clinics where the audiences can talk to critics, and you have had discussions with critics, and you have met plenty of critics, of course. So what do you think, Maaria? What are the kind of acute questions among critics or in critics' minds when it comes to today's topics, inclusion and diversity? Do you have any concrete examples of discussions you have been carrying out with the critics on the problems or challenges of inclusion and diversity?
Those discussions have been going on, at least in Finland, for a while. I'd say for about 5 years in sort of an active state. It sort of started off with cultural appropriation, which was discussed, but I think we are now at the point that we see sort of the ways the field of art criticism functions. Do we have a lot of different voices or different kind of backgrounds? And the answer is that we don't really have that many different kind of voices inside art criticism. And this is what we'd like to do, to change their structures and make a lot of people feel welcome in art criticism, both as readers of it and as makers of it. And the making of art criticism can be in many forms. It doesn't have to be written. It can be written in different languages, and it can be on video. It can be on podcasts, and so on. We are trying to make and encourage those new forms so that they could also be recognized as criticism.
That sounds very, very welcomed indeed. What have you heard from the critics so far? Do you think it's easy to make art criticism more inclusive?
Probably not, because it's of course there are no critics that are obstacles of inclusivity or diversity, but perhaps there could be more different kind of structures for making criticism, because a lot of critics are thinking these questions actively, like through their own work. How do I write about such a artwork that is made by somebody who is totally different from me, in a different social class or different gender, or belongs to a marginalized group? That is the question a lot of critics are thinking, and there must be ways that we write and speak and try to find space for those marginalized voices and different kind of approaches to criticism. Before I started this project, I really didn't realize that the sort of this field of diversity is so large, and there are also a lot of opportunities that haven't been really recognized, and this is part of our work.
So we have to recognize that the problems and the challenges are partly structural, and that's maybe something that an individual critic cannot do anything about. But you're saying that there are also techniques and methods and approaches you can use. Can you tell a little bit about the workshop, the upcoming workshop? How will you tackle these problems of inclusion by using different techniques? Is it possible?
This is something you should ask from the people who are teaching at the workshop. But I think one way of making different approaches to criticism is dialogue. In my experience, the form of dialogue in talking about the work of art, it may be a discussion by just speaking, or it can be written. We have published 2 dialogue critics in our website, just kind of approaching the work of art in a different way and from a different position than it would be usually approached, so that sort of if you look at the mainstream media, the reviews are sort of packages that are always pretty much the same, especially the short ones. But perhaps mainstream media could also find and apply our ideas, just as in other sorts of journalism.
That's a good idea. So you will be active till the end of 2022, right? So it's a 3-year project. So
yes, 2022, and also the first part of the next year. I don't know the exact point where we stop, but the last publication will be out in the spring 23.
So until then, you have the possibility to contact the project representatives and suggest some ideas and engage in developing criticism into new directions. This is really a good chance to do it. Thank you, Maaria. And we will go further to the first speaker of today, and talk about the leadership in cultural organizations. Rita Paqvalén is a freelance writer and the executive director of a service called Culture for All, supported by the Finnish Ministry of Education and Culture. This organization supports the art and cultural sector in Finland in these issues related to accessibility, equity, and diversity. So, and Paqvalén is also one of the coordinators of the network, Nordic network for norm critical leadership. So you say that in order to create inclusive and diverse art criticism, it is important not only to focus on how and what we write, but also on the composition of the we that writes, recruits new voices, makes selections, and decides which works are relevant. So you will hopefully be dissecting this we, and we can increase our understandings of what we exactly are when referring to we in criticism. So Rita Paqvalén, we are eager to learn more about inclusive leadership that connects to the critics' work. Welcome, Rita. Now we don't hear you. You are still muted. Sorry.
Okay, sorry. Okay. Well, thank you for the introduction, and also thank you for the short presentation of the project. It's a really wonderful project, and I'm very, very happy to be an honor to be invited to this seminar, and I also look forward to the other presentations and the discussions afterwards. As Maarit said, I'm the Executive Director of Culture for All service, and our mission is to help all the art and culture organizations in Finland to work with these issues. And we also both try to be reactive and to answer to the calls, but also to be proactive and also to try to work towards the arts and culture administration and other gatekeepers to, in these issues. I'm also a writer, and I used to write literary criticism, and I also have a history as a researcher and teacher in Nordic literature at the University of Helsinki. Today I'm wearing a black t-shirt, a black sweater. I have black rimmed glasses, very short gray hair. I am white, androgynous, middle-aged person. When thinking about how to audio describe myself to someone who is not able to see me, I came to think about how much we rely on norms when describing people. What we see as significant markers tells quite much about who we are and what culture we are a part of. If you paid attention, you could note that I did not gender myself. Instead, I described myself as androgynous looking. We often tend to assume the gender of people based on their looks, their names, or their voices. The need to label people, to put them into binary lockers, is so automized that we do not even realize that we are doing it. One can ask, why is that information relevant, and what do we make of it? Instead of defining my gender, I decided to describe my skin color, which in fact is rather pink. In a Nordic context, being white is being the norm. It is an unmarked position, often the center, taken for granted, undescribed. We, the white people, tend to not even to think that we have a skin color, that we are racially defined. By describing myself as white, I decided to make the norm visible, to spell it out. Norms define what is seen as natural, as normal, or what is seen as relevant, as important, or what is understood as art, and what art is considered valuable. Norms are often invisible to those who are a part of the norm. They only become visible when they cause friction, when they are the glass wall that hinder you from entering the stage, because the norm of the stage excludes people like you. When I think of the art field, I often return to the art piece by the Finnish artist Minna L. Henriksson, labeled Helsinki Map from 2009. The art piece, drawn in ink straight on the wall at Taidehalli, the Kunsthall in Helsinki, consisted of encircled names of people, institutions, and organizations within the visual art field in Finland. These galleries, museums, funders, patrons, art directors, art schools, and critics were connected to one another through thin lines, forming a complicated web of relationships. Many people, persons, and institutions had relations in all directions. They became the center, and as writers, teachers, board members, gallerists, the gatekeepers. Helsinki Map did not only show who the artists defined as gatekeepers, but it also showed how art field can be an impenetrable web of relations in which the gatekeepers define who can enter. Helsinki Map illustrates well how the field can be perceived from the perspective of someone who do not fit into the norms of the art and culture fields. For example, artists who do not have a Western art education or who never got an art education because the art programs were not accessible. Stage performers whose bodies do not fit into the binary or ableistic norms. Writers who do not write in the national languages. The Helsinki Map is a symbol of power relations and normative structures. Today, I want to talk about norms and about our roles as leaders within the cultural sector. I want to talk about power, privileges, and the role of media as gatekeepers. I will draw on my experience within the art and culture sector, and I suggest ways in how you can become change makers. Even if many of you might not be in a leadership position, as critics, you have the power to define what is art and what is not. You are the gatekeepers that decide who can enter. You are the web, part of the web that includes and excludes. I have given my presentation the title On Leadership and Change Makers, a perfectly open title when you are not really sure what to talk about. But but having given the talk some thought, I want to change the title. My new title is Towards Norm-Critical Leadership. I want to stress the word towards, because working for inclusion, equity, and diversity is an ongoing process. It is not the being, but the conscious doing. It is a process of unlearning, rethinking, re-evaluating, and redefining positions and questions, but also that we have come to take for granted. It is a critical position that requires that you identify with the notion of becoming, never really being there yet, always in the learning process, always asking yourself, what is it that I do not see? What do I need to learn? In which ways does my privileges or the norms I'm inscribed within hinder me from seeing? In which ways have the norms limited my understanding of art? I use the word to see as a metaphor. When I talk about seeing, I do not mean what can be perceived with the eyesight. I mean becoming aware of our own limitations, to see beyond the norms, to be curious toward art and art forms one does not understand, to want to learn more. That is seeing. The process of norm-critical leadership often involves courage, courage to speak, courage of speaking out, of being the feminist killjoy, of being the annoying reminder of the injustices, privileges, and structural racism, making the exclusive norms and unpleasant truths visible. Norm-critical leadership is to commit to change, to work from an inclusive art for an inclusive art field. It is seldom a popular position, but it is our responsibility. As people with power, leaders, critics, teachers, we are obliged to use our power in empowering others, in making change possible, to use our privileges to take a step back so that others, less privileged, may enter on their own terms, not on a path that we have defined for them. It is about critiquing the concept of we and them, of being aware of the problematics of using the term we, and of the diversity each one of us carries. Norm-critical leadership deals with doing the counting, who is here, who is not here, who is presenting, who is being represented, and whose stories are not heard at all. It is becoming aware of how norms are defining and selecting principles and making conscious efforts to open up. It is about conscious recruitment practices in making diversity and equity one of the selecting principles, widening the perspective and seeing the expertise and skills beyond the normative ones. Norm-critical leadership is about transparency, spelling out the values, creating safer space principles, and being committed to creating a working environment that is sensitive, open for discussions, and welcomes each one of us, regardless of our background, characteristic, identities, or abilities. Non-critical art criticism is about being curious about accessibility solutions, multilingual practices, non-normative ways of moving the body on the stage. It's about learning and unlearning and seeing accessibility solutions and as artistic strategies that open up for new understandings and knowledge productions. Norm-critical leaders within the media are aware of white, cis, heteronormative and ableist structures and are consciously working not only to diversify the art that is written about and the people who are interviewed, but also the board of critics, journalists, and people working within the media houses. It is inviting guest editors for whole issues in order to become aware of what one is missing, and in order to make changes to the media policies and to find new voices to employ. I encourage all of us to challenge ourselves and ask, what are my limitations? How do the norm define the way I work? What do I need to learn and unlearn? Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. A lovely call to question yourself, and to also, I like the call for empowering others to take such a bit of a pedagogical mission there, how to include different groups of people in the audience into the dialogue. Thank you about these interesting words. And now we can discuss a bit. I think we have some questions, and I was thinking specifically about the reviewers. You are talking about recognizing the limitations of reviewers, and I think, is there a certain normative type of a reviewer that excludes other types of reviewers, and how would that look like? Do you think there is?
I think that there is a type of policies that maybe excludes, and what we are looking for. I think that when we are looking at, I'm also talking about the art field in general, but when we go out to the art field, people are more interested in getting more audiences, for example, and how do we get new audience? How do we get new readers? And our answer is that in order to get new audiences, we have to open up the institutions to make, like, really making conscious efforts to create an inclusive environment where there are different kind of people working, different kind of voices. And when we do that, we get new audiences or new readers. And I think those are, it's a painful way, because it's, you really have to make changes to the institutions, and we are not necessarily always willing to do that. We are not necessarily always willing to do the practicalities that involves that. But there are, of course, they're all very interesting projects. And for example, in Finland, there is a group called Ruskeat Tytöt, which started out as a media platform, and they have done all kinds of projects. And one of the projects is that they have a writers' academia for people who are, well, what do they call, brown people or racialized, or whatever the term is used. And I think that is one way of sort of defining your own stage. And if we turn that into the media house, then how can the media house invite new writers and new critics, and how can you sort of open up the stage so that people can define it on their own terms, not to say, okay, come here and write about this in the way we've always done, but maybe be prepared also for people to come in with other ways of writing and other ways of doing things. And I think that is kind of be able to be open for that.
Yes, that's a challenge, to open up the door for someone who's challenging your ways of doing things. I see. I think when you are talking about the policies, that critics are very dependent on two things: the recruitment policies and practices of the media houses or the newsrooms who are running criticism and concretely employing the persons who they allow to write or not write, and then also dependent on the choices of art organizations, because if art organizations or cultural organizations that are covered journalistically don't open up for new voices, and criticism is more or less following the field, because you can only review things that are out there, that are publicly accessible. So you are doubly dependent, and there is a lot of things you can't, as a critic, change by yourself. And what comes into my mind here is also the power structures with regard to critics, because as for newsrooms, critics are related to culture departments, and cultural journalists are in the journalistic newsroom hierarchy. Cultural journalists are not always in the position of saying how a newsroom or the whole newsroom, the news organization should work, but they are also in a subordinated position in a way. To dictate how to do things so that they could change is not always easy, because it's a structural thing. And maybe there are also some internal tensions or challenges between newsrooms and freelancer communities. As in a freelance position, you are always a bit vulnerable, and you have to do what the one who is recruiting you, or the commissioner, what the commissioner says, right? How do you, and then one aspect that has also been lamented and criticized in newsrooms is that they are occupied by those in power of gatekeeping. They're maybe in some cases very male dominated. They have their own preferences when it comes to art forms or values or tastes and lifestyles. So what do you think about this? How to change the internal structures in these organizations as a critic?
I think that I think that critics can do quite much. I'm very aware of also the power structures and the difficulties freelance critics can face. But of course, there are also examples of how you can, through your writing, go a bit beyond the ways critics are different, and many critics might write in a conservative media, but still have their own voice and still make their own a voice that is not necessarily in line with the media so much. So there is a possibility. But of course, projects like this and also sort of like having the community around, that is also a way to sort of opening up the discussion that we want this. And I also know that, for example, there's been a discussion in the Swedish-speaking media in Finland about the payments and how different people are paid, for example, for columns, for different kind of text, and that discussion was about gender. And whether and I know that in that discussion there was other people coming up, and so going in like having many voices and people who have power to discuss this makes it a bit easier also to bring up. I guess maybe by starting to identify the problem is one way, is a sort of starting point, and then to see how can we work towards this? How can we work so that it's not your own vulnerable position that is, but to show the structural problems within the field that makes it. But I do also think that people who write, myself included, I have the choices also I can make choices. I can. And I also see that a lot of critics have made their own choices of bringing out projects and bringing out plays that earlier was not visible. So I think that there is a lot of things that you can do, even though you might be dictated also through
a lot of freedom anyway to take
and of course a lot of you also write on maybe in small projects, having small project money for doing other things and writing for medias that are less conservative and so on. So there's also a balance with that. But of course, institutions like Helsingin Sanomat and Hufvudstadsbladet and other big institutions have a lot of power also to alter things, and there has been changes. I think that, for example, like Wilhelm here can talk about how the steps about how to include a female composer into the. I mean, that is also a single person makes the choice to focus on that, even though it might be the newspaper's line as well.
Right. This was actually also a question for Maaria. She has left a question. Since the field of criticism is held together by various different and overlapping institutions, how could critics themselves make changes in the institution they work and participate? So we can say that there is a lot of space or room for making changes. You just have to recognize where and how, and also make space for young and marginalized people, persons to break into the newsrooms and the art organizations. Good. I think we can get back to this after hearing the other presentations. This is a very relevant discussion about the power structures of gatekeeping in many ways. So thank you, Rita, once again. And now it's time for the next speaker, who's going to focus on an aspect of ethnicity. And the title for the next speaker is The Invisible Ethnic Nature of the Western Idea of Critique. How deeply is ethnicity coded in Western thinking of criticism? And our next speaker is Max Ryynänen, who is a senior lecturer in the theory of visual culture at the School of Arts, Design and Architecture at Aalto University in Helsinki. So we want to give a warm hand to Max Ryynänen. The screen is yours, Max. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Can I share my PowerPoint?
Yes.
That's nice.
You should be able to do that. Yeah, now we can see it.
Yeah. Okay, great. Absolutely nice. So happy to be here talking about these issues with all of you today. And I really like this Critic in Aku project, actually. I think it's really made critique more visible in Finland. So it's not just a project, it really has a big impact. My talk will be about a long life work. So I need to present something. I was born in Helsinki, but I was raised first in Rinkeby and then some other suburban areas of Stockholm, which are quite diverse, as some of you might know. Even Donald Trump knows the area because he said it's the key issue for Swedish problems. People were from very diverse backgrounds, moved from different countries. Over 90% were immigrants when I was a kid. And interestingly, a lot of white middle-class art educators kept coming to the area, having art projects. But in the end, in this kind of areas, actually, these are the areas where many artists live. And also in Helsinki and all big cities, in many mixed suburban areas, you actually have the artists living there. And even my parents were artists. So in the end, I'm not sure if the idea of going always to the suburbs from the central areas, middle-class areas, white middle-class areas of the city is always such a good idea. Sometimes maybe depending on the project, but there seems to be an idea that people who are in these areas couldn't be artists, which is kind of wrong. But then, okay, also with my family background and everything, you know, we usually get mixed different families in these kind of areas. So we're kind of a quite multinational team. And we went back to Finland, but the rest stayed there. Then I went to universities at one point. And I was in Helsinki, Pisa, Temple, Uppsala. And interestingly, when you study aesthetics or art theory, issues like this, suddenly everybody is upper middle class usually. And it used to be like this, like totally upper middle class, white upper middle class. And interesting, the students were mostly female, but when you get to the level of professional work, then there were more males suddenly. And I'm happy this is at least partly over in the academia. But one could say that this was for me also in the beginning a bit of a cultural shock. And suddenly art that had for me been a broad issue of different kinds of things became in the studies, mostly a way of looking at dead white males from Central Europe or from the diaspora from Central Europe to New York or maximum local ones. When I finished and I got a job in Aalto. Happily, I went back to my childhood because I used to run this big program called VICCA. It's Visual Culture Curating and Contemporary Art, where we had approximately at worst and at best. You know, I was director, so at worst as well, because of a lot of work, but we had 130 students from 30 different countries. And now suddenly I had to teach the history of the art system, art theory, and whatever. And happily, actually, I've been always reading broadly, so it was kind of easy to tackle the issue because people had very diverse ideas and interests in this program. I had great students who came from cultures with long histories and different critiques and different forms of art systems. We will come slowly into this, why I'm saying different forms of art systems. And also these challenges made me think that I didn't have any material to use in my work. I mean, no texts. Mainly texts on these issues were written by maybe 60s German professors or so on who explain this as, like, coming back to what Rita was just talking about, like talking about our art system and the history of our art system and so on, which I realized quite early in my studies. It was not even about like what I consider to be art either. The problems continue. Just to give an example, I used to write a lot of art writing and critique for different journals, and I started to realize that also there, in questions that were made when I wrote or when I sent in a text, I realized that there's something lurking here. And when I tried, it's the same thing as when I was teaching my students, when I was writing for art journals, I felt that something is lurking here which is invisible. Sometimes the editors of the journals, magazines, said there's judgment lacking. But for me, it doesn't feel very natural to go to a performance or read a book or an exhibition and come out with a like straight value judgment. And as you can guess, not in all countries this is a typical way to deal with art, and I can slowly start to, you know, show some light from the what I'm going to talk about. It's typical, for example, from Immanuel Kant and his critique of judgment, 1790. It's a very Central European, Western Central European way of thinking, and has not even here locally been more than something that was brought very late. Well, often they say the context is not important, focus on the work itself, which is for me very interesting because I kind of see all the people engaging on the context and the world around the work as something that should sometimes be talked about. And now we're coming to another issue. In the 18th, 17th, 19th century, in many Central European upper class circles or culture, they started to focus on this idea that there is a work of art that you should focus on. You know, for example, in music, it was very late that they started to really have compositions marked, and this is the right composition, and now it's like, you should play it this way. It was often very improvised. Paintings were often actually site-specific, still a couple of 100 years ago, but then they started taking a Carpaccio from Venice and they put it into Louvre, and then it became like in this laboratory context, something that should be viewed on only by itself, you know, only as itself. Sometimes there were these questions, was the work original? And you know, you can take a look at global ideas of culture, for example, Japan, or if you go to the Middle East, and there's not been an idea of original works of art which should be somehow distinguished from others. This is also a thing that came with early modernity, and also once again the Western Central European part of the population came in with this idea. And then this neutrality idea of a subjective writing, like I could be a machine that could produce an exact objective idea of some work of art without positioning myself, was kind of interesting too. And I started to think that everywhere in my work, I had the same problem. Something invisible was lurking there. It was something that gave boundaries. It made some a priori framework for all of us working in the context where I was. And the framework came from someone else, came from another era, from another society, from another social class than from I'm from, but mainly from white males. And I started working on a book that would go into this. And I worked on it 14 years. It came out last year. It's an introduction to the historical development of this with an accent on ethnicity, class, and gender, on the philosophy of Central European art, it's called. Because often we talk about art as something which is called Western. And of course, in some sense, it could be a thing like the art world as we know it with its institutions is quite like global North, expanded then later into a more global thing, or you could think of it as something Western, but it comes actually from a very, very, very small area. So I try to tackle this gender history of genius, for example. You know, genius is used to always, when you use the word in the old times, it was always male. It was always an upper class person. It was some kind of a creative virtuoso, but always from the same class and always the same gender. Then I wanted to go into the alternative systems, and that's something I'm going to present to you as well. And now coming to the key issue of this, I'm going to use the art as a name for a concept and a framework of dealing with culture. So I need to say something at the beginning. Art is now maybe 280 years old as an idea. And before that, you didn't often think that painting and music or poetry and theater had anything to do with each other. These were separate practices. It's a bit like you could now pick up probably practices from digital culture and whatever, and think that these are not really connected, and then find a connection. I'll give another example. Sports. You didn't have the idea of sports at one point. When this modern institutional sport came, then you started to put up people who were doing figure skating and who were running into the same system, and you took that away from everyday use and made another kind of a system, which was like for professional sports and really for competitions, right? Well, to take a leap into this, a short ride, some threads and lines of thought that I thought might be interesting for this discussion, maybe even debate. Let's see what it leads to. Very interesting talk already. So Sakabe Megumi is a Japanese philosopher and critic, still living, I suppose. And he wrote an article about the way that the whole idea of being critical towards culture is actually Western colonialism. He was not only in problems with this. I mean, he's kind of open to discuss it as a thing that Japanese culture might actually need. So he went through some of the ways adding a critical perspective into cultural discussions had came to Japan in the 19th century, you know, the Meiji Restoration, and was also actually using this analysis of Western colonialism to make the point that in this sense, and here he says this, I can go into this, but he says that he thought Japan in the end was also lucky in this sense that they didn't have a critical attitude. They were gurus. And you have some famous gurus actually down there. Some of you might recognize from martial arts, because people usually know these more. So the guru system was very kind of, you know, exclusive in some sense, and it was also very, very close. So you became a part of this family around some guru, also in the artist systems. You were not allowed to criticize the guru, and actually nobody did that. And there were not much debates on this kind of things. This is Segumi's long analysis in this great book, Asian Aesthetics, which I really recommend. Kenichi Sasaki's, who's kind of really been a global theoretician of these issues for a long time, edited the book. So what did Japan have? Just to get a glimpse of what could be an alternative for what we conceive as now very natural art. Well, Akira Gamasaki, who is another theoretician, Japanese and aesthetician, has written also a great article on two distinctive systems, not as strong institutional systems as what we now call the art system. And he calls them Gedo and Yugai. There are no actual names for these. So you have two systems actually. One was the network, which is based pretty much on Zen type of thinking, you know, like meditative, reflective Zen type of thinking. And now you have to think in a very different way from the arts. You could say that there were people who were teaching the sword. There were people who were doing something that later on became modern ikebana, you know, with flowers. There were people doing calligraphy, images, text. And these people felt some kind of a communion. And they had dialogue. Even if you read some classical texts like Miyamoto Mushi's book on the sword, teaching the sword and sword fighting, he mentions poets as peers. So this was a kind of a not developed system, but it was a network of people who knew each other and conceived themselves of doing the same thing. Like what I'm doing when I'm doing with my sword, you are doing when you're writing, or this guy doing the calligraphy is doing the same. Then there's this other part, the Yugai part, which Amagasaki says that this was more like a Western type of art world, but not totally, because actually it's a very different one as well. So in this other part, there were people who were painting, they were playing music, and so on, some of these other issues, which were things that you could use when you were teaching the upper class. You could make money with this. So the upper class wanted to have educated children. Like today, the upper class and the middle class more wants to have educated children who will get some cultural status and just also just enjoy culture. It's not that simple, right? And these people were often living in red light districts. The person who was teaching painting was actually quite poor, but gave some funding from the family where this person was teaching, but was living next to the brothel and the tea house, which was tea house here, maybe kind of expanded. You could think about today's bar. So these two worlds were very different. The other one was a network of people, very meditative, often more upper class actually. And the other one was more like a bit lower class thing where people had the skills and they could make some money with it. And they were a part of the whole brothel system. And, you know, like theater is also, actors were considered to be nearly outlaws. And this was a world which was also like an area in the city. Not like today you have a trend area in the city where you have the design shops. So this was really like a low and a bit of a dangerous area where these artists live. So he gave two examples of systems. And now for somebody coming from today's Nordic countries, it might be really hard to understand the connection, but you have to just think in another way. And just to remind you, this is how the Western idea of art happened as well. You know, it's not a natural idea. If art would be a natural concept, I'm sure needleworks would be included in the art system, because we've always been doing needleworks in Europe and it's a European part of the art system, but it was made by females, so it wasn't included. Roma music would be included, but now if you have a classic which has to do with Roma music somehow, it's always some upper class Central European white guy who has made a version of Roma music into a symphony or something. So it was actually packaged by a group of people from a certain class, certain background of ethnicity, and you can think about, I'm saying kind of a, this is a very harsh one, but if you take Florence in northern Italy, go up to Paris and then go to Vienna, you get a triangle. So inside of this, upper class educated males from the Renaissance slowly until the mid 18th century started thinking that these things belong together. Like there must be something in poetry, there must be something in painting, which I can see that it's kind of the same thing. A bit like these people in the Zen background started to see that poetry and sword fighting were the same thing, right? And slowly, by publishing books, having a lot of discussions, they came up with an idea that we should call these things, first it was boas artes in Old Portuguese, then bear, belle arte, different concepts arrived, and they said, let's call this art. And this is happening like 280 years ago. Well, Amagasaki and all these Japanese scholars, Japan is in a sense lucky because the scholars have been really going through the history. In many countries, like in India, where there's a long tradition, for example, also, which is kind of recorded, nobody has really done it. I couldn't do that. I should be able to really be good in Sanskrit and stuff, and that's not possible. And everywhere in the world, you have had a long cultural history working on this. But in India, you would have the material, but nobody has really like worked on it. But in Japan, Amagasaki actually worked out really a long comparative research on these two models that I showed to you and referred to the Western one. But the interesting thing is that, and now we're coming to a complicated issue locally in Europe, Amagasaki says that in Japan, everything can be art and every day is full of art. And in Europe, art is something else. But it's interesting because then you actually apply this upper class, Central European, educated male guys, small groups definition of art. And the picture on the left would suit that one. But if you look at the picture on the right, it's music school, a Roma music school pictured in a 19th century painting, which needs to be appropriated, the music, before somebody would call it art, right? So even in Europe, and I'm talking about, I already said needleworks, there was a long even discussion if needleworks could be considered to be art. And I think Addison said in the 18th century that females can't be more developed. They can come to the level of needleworks, but not to the real arts. So there's a really misogynist discussion about what can be art. So also beside the normal art system that we were known, and which we now think should be more democratic, there have always been other constellations even around, even where the birth of the system had taken place. So you can always think of needleworks and Rome music and whatever, making masks in Lithuania or something, or porcelain somewhere in southern Poland, like a big tradition. All these things could be art, but art was created by someone. And I really want to point this out. Someone in a certain position created a system that we now think is natural. Continuing. Well, Japan has a good example also because somebody wanted to bring Western art to Japan, and that's Nishi Amane. So he created a word for it, bijutsu, like art and technique of the beautiful practices. And when he came with the system, you know, because the Central Europeans had come up with an idea that there would be dance and theater and painting, but not all of these were really like applicable for a Japanese idea of a beautiful thing, that institution. So he wanted to discuss different issues. So there was a big debate in Japan when the idea of art came that most people were against, but a small group of very powerful people thought, this is a great way of looking at culture. Okay, let's use this art. This cuts away all society and all other issues and to focus just on objects, which is a very Central European upper class idea, 300 years old. So he tried to include some Japanese arts too. He said sumo could be an art, for example. And then they had a big debate about that. And it's a good example because in many places you don't see what happened. Like I'm a Finnish person, and in Finland you can't see that. India got art system earlier than Finland, and Finnish people often think it's theirs, but it comes from Central Europe and from a social class which many of us don't have actually many roots in. You know, it's been kind of a very, very, very peripheral and a poor area for a long time, and wherever you moved in, I'm not from, actually I'm pretty spread out with my genes, but still in the area where I'm now living. People think it's from there somehow, but it's actually come like late 19th century, the idea. And people went to Paris and they decided that art exists and then they come back. Very complicated, right? I know. So a small crash course. What's considered to be Western is often just a Central European idea that was with force often taken. You know, in Japan, for example, they had to take art also at a later point, like they had to present things in museums and so on. After the Second World War, there's a lot of like cultural imperialism. Or you were taken like into, I don't think people in Finland could choose, first us who have a kind of Swedish background were bringing it half colonial way, and then Russian, upper class Russians continued bringing the system to Finland. But then often people wanted to have it. There was diaspora from Central Europe, you know, for example, a lot of Jewish people moved to United States, and East Coast United States, for example, had really a strong art system very early, before Finland. It's very male because in all those circles where they came up with what is art, I'm coming to critique back actually soon, don't worry. It's very male, it's very upper class. Started from Renaissance, and 18th century, the idea was coined, and you were listing what is art actually. There's a list from 18th century. It's like architecture, dance, whatever, you know, you can imagine the rest. Well, I already went through the reasoning of things belonging together because in the beginning people couldn't see it. For example, Goethe was against the idea of art. He said there's no point in having a concept that brings together literature and painting and all this music, whatever. But the whole idea is just for amateurs. But slowly the people who came with this idea, they won. And now we think it's really very natural. And there are 7 arts in the original list following some old medieval and South European education systems, because they used to always have a list of 7 which came from Christianity. So just some small backgrounds of how we have a weird system which now feels very natural, but in the end it's not. And then coming to a very concrete example, figure skating and ballet. In 19th century Finland, they were often still shown in the same evening. You know, first you had, for example, the figure skating, then there was a break. Then you came back and they had there was a new platform, and then came the ballet. And there was no idea that one of these would be art and one of these would be sport. And at the time, because there was no idea of that, and they hadn't grown into a separate form as they later have been, they actually did pretty much the same kind of things. And when figure skating became sport, it slowly started to change figure skating. And when ballet became an art, it started slowly to change ballet. And in what way? That's interesting. Sven Hyn's Strävtag i Österlek is a great book where he actually goes through all those artistic performances of figure skating in 19th century east part of Finland. So there used to be these artists called there was not a concept of art yet, as I said, it came pretty late, but sometimes they were called in the old sense artists, you know, like in a broader sense of the craftsmen of figure skating. And these performed artistically complicated performances, and people came to watch them. It was a bit like community art now. You will go to a city, you fix the musicians, and you put up this performance, and then there was a critique of these skating sessions. So you had a skating performance, and the main newspaper wrote a long critique about it, which is very interesting. For example, Jackson Haynes, who's very famous for also sports skating, he even died on one trip to Finland and at the time Russia. And he's actually, I think he's buried in Kokkola, but this could have continued. It doesn't continue now. These are excerpts from how you think of figure skating now, when figure skating has become a sport, like I'm talking 2 institutions that are very late. Art, mid 18th century, the idea of sport, that's like mid 19th century, and then first Olympics, 1890, so on. So if you look at some of these issues, you know, the triple Lutz and triple flip now have the same base value of 5.30 points, with the triple Lutz previously worth 590. Just examples of what critique means now in figure skating. But long time ago, the shows were different and critique was different. So institutions change traditions. Ballet became art, and it took some privileges and some freedom. And even if a lot of ballet, by many people always talk it's conservative, you have always the radical wing as well, working with animals on stage and whatever. I mean, you can, of course, it's the whole picture. And skating is kind of, you know, it decreased. So it's like a bit of entertainment. There is some Disney on Ice, and then you have the sports version. And it's just an interesting to see what critique would mean here. Well, what if, now coming to the key issue, what if skating would have become an art? If they would have decided at the point, of course, when you're maybe from Florence, you don't think of skating as a sport, neither in Paris, right? But if this would have been developed in Nordic countries, maybe skating would have become something. And during the decades, during the maybe centuries, skating would have changed. You would have surrealist skating, you would have feminist skating performances, you would have conceptual, you know, performances. Maybe I'm showing an empty eyes because, of course, at one point you would have an empty eyes on stage, just an empty eyes, or you would have blood and excretion on ice in the 60s and 70s. But this didn't happen because it didn't go to the right category. So these two things, ballet and skating, just show clearly how if you go to 2 different categories, the thing that looked quite the same starts changing into something else. So institutions change things a lot. Well, what I'm trying to say here is that I think we need to think of the whole art system, both the values and the way of categorizing it, but also the critical concepts coming from the art system as being some kind of a thing from a group of ethnic people. And I'm saying, if you remember the triangle I talked about, it's Florence, Vienna, Paris, later on London, but you know, that comes much later in the sense. So to think of these people in those upper class circles, hanging out with each other, sharing the same values, it's pretty much the same culture with that group of people. So you could, in a sense, say this triangle and that social class and the gender produce some kind of an ethnic formation, right? So a bit like we conceive Japanese Budo arts to belong and come from a certain ethnic background, or Brazilian samba does that, or Chinese Taoist philosophy, or if you happen to see some Igbo festivals and, you know, some African background, or the 64 forms of Kala, which was like the Indian system. It let like love letters and food making, poetry belong together. In the same way, this system is a product of someone, and it still has traces of that group of people that created it. And we often don't know it. We want to find alternatives for capitalism. You know, let's have an alternative way of thinking of economy. But I would like to hear more and more, can we have an alternative way of thinking about art? Like, this was produced by someone for totally different criterion, so we maybe need something else too. But of course, you can change art too. So I'm just having a couple of concepts which show some ethnic background. Originality. In most parts of the world, this had no function. Like, originality was not a thing to have in painting or poetry. But for the group of people, and especially if you think about early Enlightenment times and ideas of individuality and freedom and so on, it was kind of natural that they picked on an idea on originality, which is then taken everywhere. So then you put up a museum in Indonesia and somebody goes there and says, everybody has to make something original, and then we accept it to the museum, right? Depth, very southern German concept. You know, in many cultures, you have something that you can refer to like this as depth, and this is just surface, right? But this metaphysics of depth with this intense idea that you have to be deep, which is mainly actually classical, something that only an upper class male with a good education could be really deep, you know. And you know, these pictures of old geniuses and whatever. This is also a very, very much a cultural thing coming from one area. The 7 arts, as I said, the list was 7, and that's, for example, why they couldn't think of some other arts, and also they had other reasons for that, or sometimes gender reasons, class reasons. Came from the Central and Southern European Christian tradition of thinking that 7 was an important number. So in the end, they have actually first only 5 arts. It was like dance, poetry, dance included theater, dance, poetry, painting, sculpture, music. But because they needed to find 7, because 7 was a good number, they included architecture, and in the end, like different versions of what the 7th was, right? So it's a bit like top 3 or top 10 in our culture now, like top 10 records. You don't say, what are your top 7 records? But at the cultural system then, you have the 7. And those arts that were put there, architecture would be very different if it would have not been thought of as being a part of the art system, right? So 7 saved architecture in because they needed to have a list of 7 arts. Technical mastery, okay, this is quite universal, but of course it had there were certain ideas of technical mastery. If you think of music in the Central European upper class tradition, the educated people in Vienna or Munich or whatever had a very different idea of what is technical mastery than somebody who was an excellent drummer in Tanzania at the time. So here also the rhythms and stuff have gained a different role in what is really good art and what is really mastery of something. Non-engaged contemplation and harmony. These are interesting ones. Harmony hijacked from the historical Greeks. Central Europeans were following a lot what the Greeks were talking. Even more small privileged group of like free men in the Greek society who had dialogues, through Plato and then Aristotle and so on. This became a thing which they found in the Renaissance again, and harmony became important. Also, the idea of genius actually comes from Plato's dialogue Ion to this whole discussion. So it's actually this weird longing for a historical group of people that they have been fantasizing what kind of people were these great Greeks, and then they pick harmony. And then this non-engaged contemplation is interesting. When you read Immanuel Kant, he's talking about just kind of cold contemplation of artworks, and it doesn't have to be like that. It's whether you're listening to rap music or you listen to certain forms of music, you might want to dance, for example, or even reading could be very engaging. But they came up with this thing that was actually from their culture, this certain upper class, dry culture that they had maybe in those circles where you sit for a long time and don't say anything, and then you say something and you take off your glasses and smoke some pipe. This was their world, right? So they put in their way of experiencing things into a system that then later on was brought everywhere. And this is interesting. So for example, this idea of cold contemplation was taken to New York by force. They had a very lively Shakespeare tradition. Sorry, I'm using too much time?
1 minute, 2 minutes.
Great. Okay, great, that's fine. So by force, they were forcing people really to have a new Shakespeare. The Shakespeare of the popular culture and the folk culture was too lively and too fun and too irrational. So they forced them to take the new art version, which was developed as soon as the concept of art was mentioned. And there was a big battle. 50 people died in the Astor Place riot, for example. And they threw apples and potatoes, one form of critique, right, on the performers. Then some stuff that I think the old list of critique criteria are Chinese. And then the critic. This is interesting because females didn't have much access to the art field. They often went into journalism. So many of the early art critics were female. This is a picture of Alice Meynell, suffragist, art critic, writer, mostly 19th century work. And also the idea that critics in the beginning were supposed to develop art. So this was a university decision in the sense. So you had chairs in universities, which are for aesthetics and critical thinking and whatever started to come. And also the idea of art was finished with the idea of critics. Jean-Baptiste Du Bois, reflections, the critical reflections on poetry and painting. Jonathan Richardson the Elder published a whole book on art criticism in the beginning of the art system, just to say that this is really an essential part of art. And just a small reminder of what critical thinking might have been at the time. This is Richardson's scoreboard. Doesn't look very, very creative. So just in the end, just wanted to say that if you go to study karate, you will understand that you will be sucking in and you will be slowly marinated with some old Japanese culture, right? But when you look at art, you think often that it's universal. So what I really, really want to just say here at the whole critical tradition in art, with all the other components of the art field, or actually it's a kind of colonial thing, and it's also like a product of globalization and so on, but it comes from a group of people with certain metaphysics. There's an ethnic load, an ethnic matrix in it, which we often are not conscious of. And I think we should just try to become more conscious of it, and a list of literature for those who are interested in different stuff. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Max. I'll let you run a bit over the time because this was really thought-provoking, fantastic ideas on how to shake the structure. So thank you so much. And I guess we will have some time to discuss these ideas. There are so many ideas actually, because you took up a very, very broad field and a complex thing, like pushing the boundaries of the art world, how to define art. And myself, I have to say, you showed in a concrete way that it might be useful to look at non-Western ideas of arts, but also of criticism. And I have been recently looking at amateur reviewers in social media, and these things, seeing art as a way of play or pushing the boundaries of what's art and aesthetics and what should be reviewed, are actually present there as well. Or I was thinking of how they are, these ordinary people are, when they are reviewing cultural products, how they are reviewing things from pizza to roller coasters, from cosmetic products to underwear, or from Disney products to some kind of a story world, how they are also developing a system. And you are involved in that by developing a vocabulary and giving legitimacy to the things you are covering. And that's something we have to, as critics, to be aware of. And the other thing I was just as a commentary I was thinking about is how useful it might be teaching multicultural or multilinguistic groups. I guess you as a university educator also have the experience that when you are concretely encountering the audiences and their reactions, people who come from different backgrounds, that would also be a good way for a critic to realize how the message is being received, right?
Well, absolutely. This is actually really important, and I think it's very, very, very good if you have this kind of crowds that you have to work with. So maybe this will be useful for critics as well. I agree with that. That's interesting. So
this is a good method to educate them. Maybe we should also invite them in Rinkeby and Biskopsgården and Rosengård to talk about art. No, but seriously, how could we reach out to people if we start from the beginning of your presentation, and you said that you have been raised up in Rinkeby, how these Rinkeby, Biskopsgården and Rosengård, they are what are called vulnerable areas, utsatta områden, in Sweden. So how could you reach out to such people as a critic?
Well, can I actually comment on this with a bit of a kind of a rebound? I think the interesting thing is that I think middle-class people should go to these areas to learn from this alternative way of doing and thinking about art there. And that's where many new formations come. I mean, whether you talk about many, like you said, there's a lot of like internet discussion, whatever. Sometimes it comes from everywhere, right? But like a good example is I'm also a rap scholar, and wherever you have that, it's often in those areas. And also in Sweden, actually, like some of my favorite groups come from those areas where I was partly raised up in, mostly early childhood. But just what are middle-class people who live in a middle-class area and have a very close life? What are they missing actually when they are not getting the culture from that area? This is another way to think of it, maybe. Mm-hmm. And I would really go for the alternative. What is outside of art? What is art outside of art? It sounds complicated, but this is the way I would like to think of it. Like, how would things look if you look at that with the Japanese system? What would suit the Japanese system here, for example? Or what happens out in the art scenes which are outside of the official art world? So I would like this to be more like a dialogue and not only reaching out, because I feel also I feel it's complicated to reach out with some Central European rich guy's system. It's in a sense, I mean, it's a lot of good art, but this should be done in a very reflective way. And also maybe if people want to keep the concept, I would be for destroying it and coming up with some new ones and challenging it totally. If people want to keep it, of course, it's nice if we can make it diverse, but it should be dialogical, maybe in the sense that what can we learn? And there's a lot of things I don't know anything about Japanese classical culture, for example, or I don't know much about I mentioned Igbo culture. I'm not into that. I don't know much about it. But what could I learn? What could I learn from different suburbs? What could I learn from different areas where people are not into art? So I think it's even more complex to realize that what we don't have. And still, I mean, I'm still living in an area which is kind of mixed. Of course, Helsinki is not like Stockholm, but I live on the east side, and I learned grilling from my Indian neighbors. And this is something you can't have in some area where everybody's from the same upper class you know, white upper class areas, same background, and this makes it actually very helpful also to the other way. Like, how could you reach out to rich people? How could you reach out to people who are totally privileged and blind for this? And how could the suburbs come and teach, or something like that? I don't know how to put it, but just expanding on your.
Yes, but to go to different environments, and this is like a totally a different reality as we are living in media organizations, because they are very strictly following the institutionalized environments and send their critics to this or that exhibition or that concert by the elite institutions. So this is a very good call to do for critics to also to contest these. I felt a kind of a clash of professional cultures there as well, when we're describing how editors work, that editors have their own expectations. They are trying to fit reviewers into one mold. And then if you could think this way, to go to completely another environment and to discover another kinds of art forms and even non-art. So I guess this is a kind of a critic's dream. But how do you think how realistic it is today? How much critics are in the position of defining the boundaries of art today? Could they, for example, introduce new art forms or aesthetic forms that are not perceived as art within the art institution yet?
Well, I think critics have actually been very important for that all the time. I'm just thinking about film criticism or TV criticism. That was a kind of a late thing that came, that they have all the time been taking this to new areas and often been in dialogue doing this. It's maybe more a problem with universities and other art institutions. If you look at TV criticism, it totally makes usually sense. You know, they're thinking that this is some stuff that I don't understand this stuff. This is something I was not allowed to say often when I was a critic. I don't do that much anymore sometimes. But I mean, they totally say, I don't understand anything about this film. It's a beautiful color. I mean, you're allowed to say that in TV criticism. And I think popular culture critics, when that thing came, increasingly from the 60s, maybe 60s, 70s, 80s, started to grow. They already they had to test this thing in new contexts in a very practical way. You couldn't keep anymore this wig figure with powder on the nose from 18th century, giving these concepts and frameworks. You had to do it in a new way and in a certain form of dialogue, which was helpful. I think we are in the situation that things are opening actually quite much because of critics. They did a lot of work on this. I've been even writing about this. I find it fascinating. And still critics are doing it, but maybe not in the main newspapers, but you know, sometimes even there on blogs and professional journals and whatever. There's art journals, cultural journals. These are often great.
Then we have a question. Eija Niskanen has raised a hand, please.
Yeah, hi, interesting talk, thank you. In relation to Japan, I started thinking about this kind of, like, first of all, like gradually this kind of popular culture like anime and manga became to be taken seriously. It is now being taught or studied at universities in Japan. But also, like, an interesting part of that is the fan fiction, which is kind of like, for example, if there is a popular anime or manga, then the fans create these kind of like fan versions, and they might be, for example, very erotic or something like that, like fan manga, and they sell them at a market. There is an official market a couple of times in Tokyo, and nobody is suing them into court. Also, the Japanese companies are very strict about copyright, but nobody's suing these people. So they are kind of like integrated into a part, and I guess they are seen as useful in promotion, that there are these kind of like fans who create unofficial fan fiction about versions about like these popular even movies or whatever. I've seen one this kind of a fan fiction manga where which was about the new Sherlock, Benedict Cumberbatch and the other guy, and in that fan fiction it was clearly shown that they are in erotic relationship. So it's this kind of like what fans come up with an official, and I think that is an interesting part of this kind of like a concept of art or popular culture, whatever, like where does the creation and where's the receiver, the audience, and where is the creator, and what is in between them? So Max, maybe because you talked so much about Japan and seem to be very knowledgeable, I would like to know your opinion about this.
No, that's an interesting example, and I you know, the whole idea of authorship as we know it, it's definitely, once again, it goes back to the same triangle, same class, same group of people with wigs and powder in their face, coming up with the idea that the author does original work and blah blah blah. You know, it's the history of authorship is really short. You know, it's once again Central European upper class idea that we're talking about, which we're now breaking also in the West. There's a lot of fan fiction in the West. I'm really happy about that. That's fun. So, you know, in the Renaissance times, before you didn't know who was often the painter or who was the architect, but then comes Vasari's Lives of Painters. Suddenly, painter is a person, you know, who needs to be mentioned, and this person has a life, and we should tell the life story, for example. Then 18th century, they come up more with this idea of the genius, which makes it even stronger. That was kind of appropriated from antique and made it stronger. And then slowly you come up with an idea that somebody could have a copyright. And the authorship idea was so weak in 18th century still in Europe that there was a big debate on how could somebody own thoughts, for example, in literature. So they debated years before somebody came up with a solution that you don't own thoughts, you own a formulation. And slowly authorship started to produce also big spaces. You know, like in 16th century, they would be crazy to think that somebody is a Marxist, or even in philosophy you have this nowadays, or that somebody is like there's this whole ism following some person's work, you know, like Cubism or coming after Picasso or whatever. This is very late stuff. And Martha Woodmansey, a great actually lawyer and philosopher, American philosopher, and also Carotte-Hugon is a French philosopher who has written widely about this. Our idea of artistic freedom comes in the late 18th century because of Enlightenment thinking, and it is given to the artist. It's not given to a guy from working class, or it's not given to somebody from some other cultural background. It's given to an upper class white person who's playing around in the arts, and this person can have freedom, and this person is a genius, and so on. And then authorship becomes big. And suddenly you can't anymore do changes in Shakespeare, because in 1830s you could, 1840s you couldn't. So we have built a historical construction of what Foucault actually calls author function. And it's not even 200 years old. And I'm happy it's becoming contested, but mostly people don't know that it's a very short period, and it comes again from this weird group that I'm talking about. I don't want to say West because it's a very small area, not even Europe. So it's a short period of authorship where an author means something, and all these functions are part of the author's social and cultural existence. So fan fiction is interesting, and I think in Japan they never had this as strongly in any way. So I'm happy they are pioneering and hopefully teaching Europe to get rid of the author in some sense, in as much as we can. Of course, sometimes it's important to know the author too. It's important to know somebody's background or life work, but you know, as much as we can. Maybe they are helping us. We can ask for help.
Thanks, Max. This connects to the phenomenon of producage and presumption, where ordinary consumers are becoming reviewers in a way, maybe in a parallel system than the professional ones, but anyway, and how to encourage them to build their voice in order to create new voices in the field. We thank you, Max, for this fascinating presentation, and go further to the next presentation, which will be held by Laura Eklund Nhaga, and the title is "Under the White Gaze: How to Review Art from the Margins." So Laura Eklund Nhaga is an actress, writer, and activist. And she's interested in issues of presentation. How does presentation affect the work of an art critic? And does it matter who is reviewing, and what and how they review it? So now we welcome Laura. The screen is yours.
Hello. My name is Laura Eklund Nhaga. I'm an actress, a writer, and an activist. And I'm a student of sociology in the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom. And if everything goes to plan, I will graduate with a specialism in race and global politics. I am predominantly, as an artist, interested in the intersections of art and activism and human rights work, and what art in general can bring to activism. Because my core thesis tends to be that art can reveal parts or reach parts of humanity that academia or politics are fundamentally incapable of accessing. Today, I want to talk about whiteness and the white gaze in art. Oftentimes, I find that in discussions around representation, we hear the word allowed a lot. Who is allowed to play a character or write about a topic or, I guess, critique it? The word is oftentimes employed by the not marginalized group that feels they are disallowed something they are entitled to. The right to portray someone else's experiences, the right to write about someone else's experiences or analyze them. However, in conversations about representation, the real question rarely is someone allowed to do something, or rather, are they qualified to? This applies for all societal power structures, not just whiteness. It applies when queer art is consumed by a straight audience, when transness is observed by a cis-normative audience. It applies to disability and class, to everything. I've generalized my points to have to do with whiteness because it makes a good title, but also because it's the easiest topic for me to talk about and for me to observe in my everyday life and in my career as an artist. But these phenomena that I'm about to discuss are not limited to whiteness. 15 minutes is a short amount of time to completely analyze the intersections of art and oppression, but for the sake of simplification, I'm going to talk about two main points. First point has to do with the neutrality of whiteness, or the supposed neutrality of whiteness, I guess. And the second part has to do with the concept of good art and how that is inherently colonialist and oppressive. Rather than making concrete rules about everything, it is important to understand that normative experiences are not neutral. Both in art and in society, whiteness is a norm and a default, as we've discussed today already. And one thing I often run into in navigating the art scene is white people's unwillingness to admit that certain experiences and stories might be outside of their comprehension. I oftentimes work with poetry. I write and perform it and also have translated it. My poetry is a Black experience. And as we all know, poetry is not very explicit in meaning oftentimes. There's not concrete meanings that it creates or communicates. And the amount of times there has been a case where a metaphor of mine or something that I wrote into the text that is obvious not only to me, but to my peers who experience similar phenomena of racialization as me, have recognized from my work or other works that is obvious to us, but is completely incomprehensible to people of, well, in this case, white people, but people that have the power in any given societal structure. And that is fine for an audience member because everyone derives their own meaning from a piece. But when it comes to effectively analyzing the piece, it could potentially become an issue. Oftentimes in reading critique of my work, people tend to refer to me as an angry Black woman, not in those words as such, but because my work has to do with racism, and specifically it's very subjective rather than trying to aim for objectivity or for discussion. It's a description of a subjective experience, as poetry tends to be. And oftentimes the adjectives, even when I'm being praised, the adjectives that are being used carry the angry Black woman trope. Now, if it was normalized for people in the art scene to have even basic understanding of race theory or racism, it would be fairly obvious to a person that maybe the way to review a Black woman's work is not to call them a racist trope. But in Finland, or in truth, anywhere in the Western world that I'm aware of. I live in the UK. It's not a norm for a person who is reviewing art to have a basic understanding of societal structures, even though in my opinion, they should. One time I was in part of a production, and we were sitting around and we were sharing the pieces of writing that we had made for the production. One friend of mine, another Black woman, read a poem about relaxing hair, which is a procedure in which a person with chemicals straightens their hair to be straight from usually Afro-textured hair. I was the only person who understood what was happening in the poem, because she didn't outwardly say the words because it's poetry. All the other non-Black people in the room said things like, oh, I don't really know what it's about, but it was pretty, or I like the atmosphere, or I like the rhythm. I, on the other hand, was left with many emotions and thoughts, and I related to the poem, the experience, but also thoughts about its wider cultural implications and potential political interpretations. Atmosphere and rhythm are very important in a poem, but it becomes a problem if you don't know what the poem is about, if you intend to effectively critique it. It is important to understand, as a person from that holds a privileged position in any given power structure, that your life experiences, in this case in a white body, are not universal or neutral. As a result, in consuming art that is made from the margins and for other people within those margins, it is more than likely that you will not be able to understand all of the nuances of that work, unfortunately. So the question isn't, is one allowed to critique something, but rather, are they the right person to do it? At the very least, when approaching a piece where the themes are outside of one's expertise or lived experience, you should acknowledge it in your approach. In sociology and in research, it is common practice to state your own profile, what race you are, what country you're from, what your economical standing is in relation to the topic of your research, so that the people who are peer reviewing your work understand potential biases, even as you actively try and get rid of them. Sorry, I lost my point, the bit that I was reading. I make it clear to the readership, do research, don't just assume that you naturally have the ability to understand a piece. And maybe an even more important point, my second point, to keep in mind when discussing the white gaze is the fact that our idea of what is good art is fundamentally rooted in colonialism and oppression. Higher forms of art are usually the ones that are the most inaccessible for the working class or people of color, such as opera or even theater or ballet. Genres of music created by people of color, which are honestly at this point almost all of the genres, are regarded as lowbrow, whereas classical music is considered to have the most value, as it is the only prominent music genre created by white people that we consume in modern society in generalized terms. Even the norms of how a good story is told are fundamentally Western. I got into an argument with an actor friend of mine because he's English and he's an actor, so of course he loves Shakespeare. I'm ambivalent to Shakespeare. I have nothing against him. I enjoy a good trip to the globe, but I also I'm not as intensely into Shakespeare as English people tend to be. And my friend was saying that Shakespeare's genius because he discovered ways of storytelling that are still used today. And I said that surely you understand that Shakespeare appears to be a good storyteller because the norms of storytelling, the conventions of storytelling that we use today are fundamentally affected by his work. I'm not saying that Shakespeare isn't a good storyteller, but fundamentally, it's not that there is a fundamental good art. It is that we are used to a certain type of art, and our sensibilities dictate what kind of art we are likely to enjoy in the future. And this becomes a problem when it exists in the context of reviewing art that is made from different cultural contexts than you are from. And because whiteness is globally dominant and even a violent phenomenon, it becomes oppressive in the process. This is a really like garish example, but even if you don't hold the opinions about classical music or popular culture or rap music, you probably have internalized them just by living in a racist society. And therein lies the risk of either misunderstanding or undervaluing forms and structures of art that come from outside of the white West and middle class sensibilities and hegemony. I'm sure we all understand that no piece of art exists outside of wider culture and society. Therefore, in analyzing art, we also have to have some awareness of its cultural environment, context, and history, but also our own potential limitations in properly analyzing it. Unfortunately, none of us are unaffected by the oppressive structures of our society. And similarly to a sociologist or a researcher, I believe that a responsible critic is one that is aware of their own internalized biases. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for a very interesting presentation, which adds an important factor to reviewers' self-reflexivity. Who is allowed and who is not allowed. So now it's time for questions. I think you have many. You can just raise your hand in the audience. But I would first want to address this question of being or not being allowed and not being able to understand the experiences of a certain group. What could be done then if you are not part of a minority and you would like to review a minority work or a work produced by a minority member? Do you think you can learn about the experiences if you put yourself into a dialogue with a minority member or with a member of another community you are involved in by yourself, or is it a better alternative to end up in not reviewing the piece at all?
Well, first of all, the first question is, should you review it? I know that sounds really harsh, but truly the first question is, should you review it? Second of all, I doubt that, especially if you write for a paper, I've never worked for a paper, so I don't know for a fact, but I doubt that you have the time and the resources to effectively immerse yourself into a different culture every time you need to write a review. I don't think that is sustainable. And thirdly, even with a dialogue, it's not the concept of going to Rinkeby and extracting information and knowledge and experiences from other people for you to make art out about it is inherently colonialist. Like, you can't, in sociological research, there is a lot of rules that go with ethics. You can't just go into a place and then strip it for knowledge and go home and get paid for your research. Similarly, I think it's fundamentally problematic to think I am going to now be in dialogue and take advantage of this person's sometimes trauma, but generally like knowledge and lived experience in order for me to do my job better. The wider context asks the question, why don't we have critics from more cultural backgrounds? So why don't we have someone who already has this knowledge from their own like they're in the background? And that is a very, very like black and white answer. Of course, in practice, I would prefer that a piece gets attention, especially if it has to do with a minority identity, than it not be reviewed at all. But I also think it's important to paint quite clear guidelines to then apply to any situation. Every situation is different, and I think it's kind of reductionist to look for a rule set that applies to everything. But I think it's an interesting question, or like it's an interesting discussion, because I feel like oftentimes the assumption within the discussion is that the critique or the translator or the artist has to be a white person, and then we discuss how to best appropriate or extract the knowledge so we make good art about these people, and we never ask why isn't it accessible for them to do the critique or the art or the translation themselves.
Yes, but that's a very relevant question, and I think the way those in power are resonating or thinking about this question is that we cannot always have a reviewer that would be similar to the producer of the work that is being reviewed. So those who are in the position of being reviewers may then be able to translate the experiences even from foreign cultures and foreign communities, as in an anthropological sense, or ethnography is also based on a researcher who is not originally from a community, going in, penetrating that community and trying to live with that community. And yes, sorry, I'm just saying that maybe this is the thing that that is often repeated in this context, that the majority person may be able to translate the experiences to a majority experience, to a majority audience, and then reach the same level of experiencing it, rather than a person who the target audience, because media houses are thinking about their target audiences, and it's always then the majority, the biggest possible general audiences, like in newspapers, then that they would not be able to relate to the minority representatives.
That is a wild assumption.
But you're contesting that idea.
First of all, ethnographies in general in my field of scholarship are highly contested for the exact reason of going into a space and supposedly immersing yourself into it, because anthropology and ethnographies as a practice are deeply colonial in their origin, and the decolonization of them is still in process. But I am a Finnish person. I have a Finnish cultural framework, but I'm also a Black woman. Also, any minority person who lives within the wider context of white hegemony can communicate with white hegemony. It is a wildly kind of an offensive implication that a person who is of a minority status can't effectively communicate their own culture to the target audience, like the supposed target audience of a paper. That's a bit, I don't think that theory holds water whatsoever.
No, well, then we come to the question how to encourage representatives of different minority communities to become reviewers. What kind of educational interventions are needed? Because we know that if we look at, for example, journalism schools, there are not that many people from different backgrounds, and there's also a linguistic norm that you have to be able to write in Finnish, and it's not a multilinguistic study program. And when you are when we are educating people from different backgrounds, maybe there might be a specific study program, as for the journalism program in Finland for Haagahelia, started in 2019. So how to make this more inclusive, that minority people could be integrated into the dominant structures and not just creating specific study programs for those people. Do you have a solution here? What could be done to promote the diversity of voices?
Inclusion is its own field of study in itself. I'm not an inclusion strategist, but from my experiences from occupying white spaces, I've been the only white person in almost a non-white person in almost every space that makes art since the beginning of time, since kindergarten, all the way to performing arts high school, all the way to the now current, the work that I do. And a thing that I find myself saying a lot recently is that it's not good enough for inclusion to open the door and expect people, open a door to a fundamentally white space and expect people to just walk through it. Anti-racism is not passiveness. It needs to be active. These institutions, schools, but also institutions such as papers and theaters are fundamentally built on a basis of excluding people, certain bodies, as was stated earlier today. Therefore, and the normal state of society at the moment is fundamentally racist and oppressive to multiple other groups. In order to undo that, you have to actively resist it. And these spaces are not safe for different bodies as long as we're not actively trying to disassemble the white hegemony within them. A concrete example of this, for example, is that whenever I get an acting job, I have no way of knowing whether or not the person there knows how to do makeup for me or knows how to do my hair. So now I am tasked with either doing my own hair, which I'm not a professional at, or finding someone who can do my hair, which I'm not paid for. So that is an example of how the space is fundamentally exclusive of a person with my experience, despite the fact that it's supposedly open to me. And in many cases, it's very stressful. And you can't expect everyone to be able to or willing to go through that in order to penetrate the institutions that fundamentally have always rejected them. The anti-racism needs to happen within the institutions, just separate from whether or not there are already people of color or people of minority status within them. So it's a weird question it's a question that I face a lot of but we've had these programs and we do these things and nobody ever shows up. It's not that people don't care about art, that the minority people don't care about art. In my university, every time there is a play that is done by the Anti-Racism Society, there's a line auditioning people around the block. Whenever plays are auditioned by any of the other societies that have white hegemony within their structures, people of color barely do audition because that space has not been made safe for them. How to make a space safe is not my area of expertise. I have some ideas about that, but I feel like if you want more structured feedback for that, you should consult someone whose job it is to make spaces inclusive. But it is not good enough to just open a door and hope for minority people to walk through when the space within the door is not safe for them.
So you have to change the structures and also educate the people who are holding the power to understand their position in power. Good. Then there is an audience question. Axel Andersson has raised a hand. Please, Axel. Let's see. You have to be unmuted.
I have to unmute myself. Yes. Do you hear me now? Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Okay. It's not so much a question, but a reflection on this topic of who can review what, and it's I'm a Swedish critic living in Norway, and I was recently at an event here in Bergen where there were 4 very white Norwegian critics reviewing a book by a Sami writer. And half of the book was in Sami, and the content of the book was a kind of attack on majoritarian white Norwegian society, in which all Norwegian people were portrayed as lizards. So they had this kind of, it was like a fable-like aspect of this thing. So it was this, and I'm saying this because the discussion was extremely illuminating as well, how these 4 critics kind of related to this thing. There was an attack, like a broadside attack against their identity, against their sense of history, etc., and so on, and how they had how they had consulted people they knew to maybe or Google translated some parts of the Sami text and stuff, and also how they related to the question of the aesthetic judgment in relationship to this thing that was also an attack on them. I'm not saying this, I'm not disagreeing with any of the inclusion things that have been said previously. I'm just saying that it was a very edifying experience because it also put something in play. Like, what is this when we put it out in the public space, and what is it to kind of discuss whether critical judgment is possible or not? And this was made possible by this very homogeneous kind of majoritarian audience to this work. There was, in a sense, also the appropriate audience in some way, since the book was also an attack on that audience. It was, of course, also written for a Sami audience, for their perspective. So, of course, it would be very interesting to have a Sami review that could be in between the cultures and so on. But it was also edifying this other dimension. And so it was just a little observation. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Axel, for sharing this experience from a minority that is living both in Norway and Sweden and Finland. So this made it a truly Nordic commentary. Thank you. Then the time is running.
Can I say?
Sorry, do you want to comment, Laura?
Please. I think it's a bit inappropriate that somebody talked for like 40 minutes and now I don't have time to answer questions or like discuss. So it sounds to me from your description that is a good example of the critique group approaching the work from the specific point of being the oppressor within the equation, which is, I think, the only correct way to go about that. And also, it might have not been clear, but I do think fundamentally that the question shouldn't be, is someone allowed to do something? The question should be, should someone do something? And the answer isn't always no. I'm sure there are ways to do these things well, but yeah, thank you. That was a really interesting story.
Thank you, Laura. And I was about to ask your final words, so you can still give one commentary. Now to wrap up, if we would make a short action plan, how would you promote inclusion and diversity for reviewers? What should we do? What's the most acute question to keep in mind? And I want to give a final word for each presenter. If you would like to say something to a Finnish, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, Icelandic, Nordic, international, whatever, critic, what would it be in terms of inclusion and diversity? And maybe you can, Laura, you can continue here, and then we can go further to the other presenters in a reverse order. But I have to say that Rita has left us already because she had to rush further. But Max and maybe Maaria, and yes. So Laura, you can first.
What should we do? Big picture. I think anti-racist activism or just any human rights activism has to do with fundamentally examining yourself as much as you examine your environment. And I think that is also important in reviewing and consuming art, is to understand the cultural context that it comes from, whether that context is foreign to you and therefore you understand the work better, or whether it's your context, which is fundamentally flawed in human rights ways, so you can understand its either successes or its failures when it comes to wider cultural context.
Thank you, Laura. Then Max, what would you say to this question, your action plan?
Well, it's hard to give action plans because one can see only a very small part of the institution. And right now I'm seeing really a small piece of the big cake. But at least professional practices can be challenged everywhere. And even more, I think when people are in power, you can do things. And you should just open up. People should be able to say that they lack a sensitivity and they don't want to do something. You know, now the professional life is like a train. It just goes and you work and have to do things, and it should be more open for people saying that I'm not able, or asking questions. And in critique, I think it's often there is still this. It's there's still this German guy saying, like, giving a judgment, and knowing everything, and it shouldn't work like that. But this is hard how to establish that. I have no idea. But it's something we can for sure change. We are not perfect. Nobody's perfect, and we should be able to position ourselves and say that.
Thank you, Max. What about Maaria? Your final word.
Thank you, everyone, for your presentations. It was very, very interesting to hear all of you. My final word for this action plan question, I think, well, this is perhaps very much a work for critics that they have to do by themselves. They have to think what to write, how to write, about what kind of work of art can one write. And I think a big challenge is this idea of universalism that has been mentioned in different speeches here. So that how do we regard art works as universal in as for taste or beauty and sort of things that do always exist in art reviews. So that is sort of a question I kind of started to think over here. But there's also a lot of institutional work, and there's kind of like Finnish Critics Association and this Shine on Critique project, and also media where criticism or art criticism is published, perhaps could learn some new things and new points of views about criticism as well. Yes, thank you. Over to Maarit again.
Thank you, Maaria. Our action plans are good. They are quite concrete anyway. And I think if I say myself, what I was thinking, what I'm taking with me from this session is that in terms of inclusion, we should maybe, as critics, create dialogue with audiences, with minority groups. At least, even if you may not be able to comprehend, you may be able to learn, and getting into touch with different communities different from yours is the key. And when it comes to diversity, encouraging minority persons to become critics and to create a diversity of voices within the field is a key question. So my dear critical friends, now the time is definitely up, and I want to say thank you so much for following today's session. Thank you for our fantastic speakers, Rita, Max, and Laura, for sharing their insights and experiences today. Please keep an eye on the project webpage, kritiikkinäkyy.fi, for the next webinars and also workshops. We would be very happy to see you again in March. So thank you for listening and engaging, and try to be as inclusive as you can. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.